Do you like to generate AI images? Do you want your images to look realistic and stop looking like this? Well, you've came to the right place. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to generate images and have them look realistic and not look like garbage. I'm going to be using Comfy UI in the video, but you can apply this to any UI it is that you use. So let's check out the video. We're using Stable Diffusion XL. That is the latest version, well, as of recording of this video anyway, of Stable Diffusion. The Stable Diffusion XL model that we're going to be using is Juggernaut XL, which is a common model that people use. The settings we have here are the width of the image is 768 and the height of the image is 1152. The reason why it's set up like this, with Stable Diffusion 1.5, which is probably the most popular because it's the initial release of Stable Diffusion, the model was trained on images that were 512 by 512 pixels wide. They were square images and they were much smaller. But with Stable Diffusion XL, they were trained on larger images, so 1024 by 1024 pixels wide. If you do not generate images at the size or close to the size that the model was trained at, you'll have all kinds of issues. So if you're generating images with 1.5, you have to make sure that this is closer to 512 by 512. And if you're generating images with SDXL, you have to make sure it's closer to 1024 by 1024. SDXL is a little bit different because they didn't just train on square images, they actually trained on a bunch of different things. Also, there's ways to get around that issue that I just mentioned, but I don't want to get too much into that right now. In general, you want to do 768 by 152. The reason why we choose this instead of 1024 by 1024, which is the resolution that Stable Diffusion XL was trained at, is because we want to have a portrait image. In general, portrait images are more going to be representative of photos or pictures of people, pictures of things, whereas square images or whereas longer images are going to be more representative of landscapes and these sorts of things, right? Whereas we're going to be generating an image of a person here. You understand? All right, so the settings here, the sampling steps are set to like 20, the CFG is set to 7, the sampler is EULA Ancestral. Largely, these are just basic settings. There's nothing here that's gonna be too interesting for the most part. These are just the normal settings. I just want to show you so you know what they are, what I set them to. In the video, all of the images that I generate will have the exact same seed. So just be aware that all of the images are using the same seed. What is the seed? You can think of the seed as being the starting point for the image. If I have a starting point of 5 and I add the prompt woman jacket, if I add this prompt, when I generate an image, since the starting point was 5 and the direction was the prompt, you can look at it like that. The seed is the starting point and the prompt is the direction. I will end up at the same location. Like if I try to generate this, because this is the image that I have currently generated with this prompt and this setup. This is the image that's generated. If I generate this again, I will get the same image. You understand? Now, if I change the seed or I change the prompt, because I've changed the direction, I am now going to get a new image. So the important part about using the same seed is that you can see what the impact of the changes that we make are, since if we were to change nothing, we'll get the same image. If you're completely new to Stable Diffusion, this is what you would have. You'd come in, people tell you can generate images and they can look so good and you can get all these cool things. You generate an image, you get an image that looks like this and you're like, what the hell is this? This looks terrible. You wanted a woman wearing a jacket and you put this there. In fact, you probably would have woman wearing a jacket. The reason why we have woman jackets here, I mean, there's a lot to explain in that. In general, you can think of Stable Diffusion as being closer to a classification system rather than a sentence-based system, meaning that the model that is at the base of Stable Diffusion can understand individualized concept easier than it can understand grouped concepts. So essentially, woman wearing a jacket should be harder technically than woman and jacket. It doesn't need to say wearing. You just list the qualities that you want as opposed to describing a woman wearing a jacket walking down the street next to a building where a dog is running on the left or whatever. You just want to list woman, street, dog, running. That's what you would want to say. Okay, so that's why we have woman jacket here. But this is probably where you start off. If you're a complete new person, this is what you would end up with. And you can see that the image is absolutely terrible. The image is very smooth. The background here does not look defined. It looks like it has vague shapes, but stuff in the background looks more like just blobs as opposed to buildings, which is probably what it's supposed to go for. Her shirt has like no detail in it. It's just not very good is what it is. Yes, the first basic thing we want to fix here is we want to add a negative prompt. So what is a negative prompt? Very much like how you have a text prompt that will include the things you want in the image. A negative prompt is the opposite. It tells you the things that you don't want in the image. So it removes things from the image. So I'm going to go and show you this. Whenever you're generating images, you should have a negative prompt. 9 times out of 10, that's something you should have. You should have a basic version that you simply paste in to everything. that you use, and then you make modifications based on the individual thing that you're attempting to do. If you're newer and you didn't know this is an important thing. I've even seen some people who've been using this for a while not even know about this. The first part of the negative prompt here, we have worst quality, low quality, normal quality. Okay, what's that? The quality tag. One thing you have to remember is when you're adding stuff to your prompts, you're not adding what it is you want to have in the image. You're adding the descriptions of things that you want to have in the image. That might seem like the same thing, but ultimately what it means is you have to think of how would people generally describe those sorts of images on the internet? How would people generally describe those sorts of images on the internet? And if they would be tagged in a certain way. Effectively, if I showed you this, what would you say it is? Would you say it's a dog? Would you say it's a worse quality dog? Would you say it's a normal quality dog? You probably wouldn't say any of those things. You say it's a dog, it's a cat. These are the sorts of things. You have to think of the words that are used to describe the images. If you want to get more specific, it would be the general alt text that images would have on the internet. It's basically just a thing that's helpful for people who cannot see. It's like if you can't see and you're looking at a web page, you'd be able to know what's there because it would say a photo of a dog or photo of a cat or whatever it is. And it would speak it out to you. So unless you would expect that a worse quality picture of a dog, a best quality picture, a normal quality picture of a dog are in those things, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to have these tags. The reason why I have this in a negative prompt, by the way, is this is something that you will see. If you see images online, you see people sharing images, you will see this in their images. And you might wonder, why? Is everybody going mad? Is everyone stupid? Well, no. In the initial version of Stable Diffusion 1.5, there was a leak of a proprietary model. Effectively, there was this company that was selling a Stable Diffusion model, and their model leaked. Basically, their model leaked. And when that model leaked, people gained access to that model. With Stable Diffusion models, you can take models and you can mix them with other models. Anyway, long story short, that company, when they trained their model, when they trained it, they specifically added these tags in to images that they had classified with a separate classifier that classifies images based on the quality. They'd add worse quality to the ones that had the lowest score. They'd add low quality to the second worst, normal quality to the middle, and then best quality to whatever was the best quality. No, I think it was masterpiece quality was actually the best quality images. Regardless though, what you need to understand is because that model leaked, this information actually has meaning if you're using Stable Diffusion 1.5. Now, if you're using Stable Diffusion XL or something else, then it's unlikely that these will have nearly as much value. That is unless the person who made the specific model that you're using decided to follow the same training policy as the company who had their model leaked, which some people have done. The reason I'm mentioning it is because you might see stuff like this and think, oh, I just say bad and terrible quality or atrocious quality or whatever, right? Unless you would imagine that somebody would have a description of an actual atrocious quality image and they would have that in the alt text of an image, then it's unlikely that that would be valuable, okay? Alright, so the second part here, we have actual better quality tags, ugly and deformed. So these are things that will be more likely to describe actual images on the internet that have problematic things that don't look good in general. Okay, so then we have this part here that largely deals with anatomy, bad anatomy, missing fingers, bad hands. Essentially, what you need to understand, Stable Diffusion, it will have issues generating hands a lot. There's stuff you can do to attempt to fix that, but in general, from a prompt perspective, these are one of the things that people add in. If you're unfamiliar, these tags follow a Buru naming convention. If you're familiar with image boards, they have this specific subset of tags that they use. These are what these tags are actually derived from, by the way. A lot of models train using these, even if the models are not anime related, they will train using these tags. The next part we have here, JPEG artifact. JPEG artifacts, these are like things that you see with JPEG images. When they get compressed too much, they'll look like this. And then we have text, signature, watermark. This part of the prompt has to just deal with text in general. In general, when it comes to diffusion models, they're bad at rendering text. There are things you can do to try to get around that, but for the most part, they're not very good. So a good rule of thumb is to just remove them in order to improve the quality of the image, especially things like watermarks and these sorts of things. Anyway, if we generate the image now with these new things, remember, we have the same starting point because we have the same seed, but our prompt has changed. Our positive prompt hasn't changed. We still have woman jacket. This is what we started with, but our negative prompt has changed. So if we generate images now, okay, so you should see a massive improvement in the quality of the image here, right? They have the same overall generalized aesthetic because it's on the same seed and it's, well, a similar prompt. However, the actual quality of the image has gone up by a decent amount, okay? Yeah, the shirt that's here actually has better quality to it. It actually has texture, whereas in this, it's just completely one layer. It looks like plastic almost. Her skin has texture as well. The background actually looks more like a blurred out version of a real life building would look like, as opposed to this, where it kind of just looks like a blob, or looks a bit weird. It looks like it's vague strokes that don't actually properly represent a building. Another common thing that I see people do is that they want their images to look realistic, so they simply just add realistic. And the thing is, this isn't completely wrong, but if we go back to what I said initially, you want to think of how people would describe things on the internet. In general, if I showed you a real image of a real person who really exists at a restaurant or in a park somewhere, and I showed you that image, would you describe this image as say, look at this image. Wow, that is a realistic image of a person at the park. Wow, that is a realistic image of a person walking down the street. Wow, that's a realistic image of a person flying a helicopter. You know what I mean? That's not how you would describe this image. You'd say that a photo of a person flying a helicopter, a photo of a person walking down the street, a photo of a person doing whatever the hell else. That's what you would say. What you wouldn't say, a realistic photo of a person. The very funny thing is, almost exclusively, the word realistic is used to describe images that aren't realistic, which is even funnier, because you'd use it on an image like this. You'd say that's a realistic drawing because it looks close to being real, but ultimately it isn't real. It's just somebody who drew this image and it looks close to being realistic. That's how you describe those things. Realistic isn't actually how you get realistic images inside of Stable Diffusion or any AI image generator for that matter, right? This is probably one of the most common mistakes that I see people do. This also stands for stuff like photorealistic as well. It's not usually what you would want to do. Instead, what you actually want to do is something like photo. That's it. You basically want to think of what words would describe an image that has realistic properties. Keep in mind, another thing I want to say, it's not like if you add realistic to your image that it will not look more realistic. I mean, it will. But ultimately, if you're trying to get maximum realism, when you're using your descriptions, you're always going to get a lesser version of what you've asked for. So you can think of it as realistic is here, but photo is like here. You understand? It will make your image look better if you add realistic, but it will limit you, since realistic always is an image that is close to realistic but not exactly realistic. So you're almost capping yourself if you add that to your thing. We'll see what image we get. So this is with the word photo. Interesting thing about this is I would say that with these ones, well, maybe this one is slightly more realistic than the last one, but I would say it's mostly like a side grade from the last one. When you have very, very generic terms, they tend to have less of an impact on the image purely because that is a more diluted concept that a lot of images have. Building off of that, we have these other keywords that we're going to add. They're going to seem a bit random, but yeah, I'll explain them in a little bit. We have ISO, and F/. These are not the cheat codes for unlocking unlimited lives in Stable Diffusion. What these actually are descriptions of settings that you would use if you were using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. If you're a photographer and you use a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera, then there's a bunch of settings that you can change, right? You can change the lens that you use. You can change the ISO, which would be like the light sensitivity. You can change the aperture, which would be like the amount of light that's let in on the lens physically. So by adding these keywords to your images, people have an image and they would say, this is a shot on an 80mm lens with 400 ISO, aperture 1.6, which would be written as f/1.6. That's how you would like write that or whatever, right? So what we're doing here is effectively attempting to add all of that data in. But you'll notice I don't give an aperture range. I don't say the size of the lens. The normal amount would be if I had 80mm, I had ISO 400, I had like f1.4. This would be the normal camera setting. Why don't I have that? The reason why I don't have that is you don't actually care about the individual settings. You just care about the aesthetic. You're trying to essentially get it where the model is starting to reference higher quality images. That's what you want. And you want to reference all of them. Okay, you don't want to reference, say, specifically ones that are like this or specifically ones that are like this. You just want to reference all of them, right? Maybe the model might have a generalized understanding of what aperture means, what ISO means, and these things in a general sense, but it might not understand what ISO 1.1 is, ISO 1.2 is, ISO 1.3, or not ISO, but aperture 1.1, aperture 1.2, ISO 400, ISO 200. There's less information for those, and the more specific you make things, you might make it where you actually end up hurting yourself, when in reality you just care about the general aesthetic of people who would list those settings as opposed to a specific setting. You understand? I will leave this one though. I will leave it at 80mm, since in general that tends to make the images better, but that's the logic there. This is where it's coming from, and that's how you want to think about attempting to create good images using Stable Diffusion. So you can see with this image, one thing that you'll immediately notice is just how blurred out the background is. If you're using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, generally you're going to have a greater amount of depth of field, so it's common for that sort of thing. You'll also notice how more realistic in general the image looks. Another aspect you'll notice as well is the pose that the person adopts, where they're standing in a more professional way. This is another aspect you want to think of as well. Okay, you could think of what sort of images would have that would be generally images that are taken by photographers. But if it's a photographer taking an image, right, and it's a woman, then likely the woman woman that is in the image is a model. You understand? Since a photographer might have 80mm, f/, or all of these things, but if the photographer is taking an image, taking a photo, I mean to say, and the photo is of a woman, it is likely a model. Meaning that the person that is in the image ends up adopting the aesthetic that those people would generally have. So all of that is to say that the reason why she's posed like she's a model, even though all I asked for was camera settings, is because those camera settings are generally associated with taking pictures of models. Again, a lot of what I'm trying to do here is get you to think about how image generation works more intimately, so you can get a deeper understanding of how to really increase the quality of the images and less the specific settings that you're supposed to do, though I'm going to show you specific settings as well. I want you to get an understanding. I think that's way more important than the specific knob you have to turn or the specific dial you have to turn. But again, this image obviously looks more realistic than the last one, but there's more stuff that we can do as well here. We had our generalized negative prompt. We haven't actually made any adjustments of it thus far. So one of the things I'm going to show you is adding additional things to your generalized negative prompt. Remember, this negative prompt that you have there, this would just be something that you copy and paste around. You don't really think about it, right? What we're gonna add here is 3D, anime, and cartoon. Why are we adding this? Obviously, if you have a model, they might have parts of the model that are trained on different things. They might have models that are trained on 3D stuff. You might have models that are trained on anime stuff. You might have models trained on cartoon stuff. In general, just specifically with Stable Diffusion, if you ask for 3D, it's really bad 3D. So then you have anime. Again, that's pretty self-explanatory. You're trying to get realistic images of people. You don't want anime images, so by doing this, you remove that. Cartoon, again, same thing. We could look at a few things. Her skin has gotten a lot less smooth. If you see here, from this one to this one, there seems to be more depth, more wrinkles, more imperfections, effectively. When it comes to stuff like anime and cartoons and these sorts of things, it's gonna have flat colors relative to a real photo. What that basically means is, if I remove anime from a real image, you should have an image that is more detailed than what you would normally have, because anime images generally will be flat relative to real images. You understand? Okay, so we talked about the positive prompt, and we talked about the negative prompt. Another thing we can talk about is what I call a light negative. And this is an interesting concept. The idea of the light negative is the stuff that you don't mention in the prompt won't happen. You'll notice is that in all of the images, the person isn't smiling. They're kind of just standing there with expressionless face, just like looking towards the camera. They're not really doing anything. And the reason why is because we didn't mention it. A realistic image would have more depth to it on the context of there'll be some sort of emotion being represented by the person. So we could add the word smile here as a way of representing that. Yeah, and you can see this image here. I wouldn't necessarily say this looked immediately 100 times more real than the last image, but the important part is that there's some additional layer that we are changing to add in realism. We're not trying to just add in keywords that make it look more realistic. We're adding things that realistic images would have in order to make it look more realistic. You understand? Another one we could do as well is add something like hand on head, so that she will put her hand on her head. Yeah, you can see here that again, the overall structure of the image has improved in the sense that now we have a smile, we have a hand on head. I think her face isn't as good as the other ones, but that will be fixed later. The point here is to show you that realism exists on multiple axes. It's not just a matter of photorealistic, how every pixel is. It's also what is the person doing in the image, what is happening in the image. But that idea doesn't just apply to the person, it also applies to other elements in the image. Like for example, you notice in most of these images, the person is just standing in a field somewhere. That's despite us not really commenting on where they should be. When you see that sort of thing, I call this like leaning into the bias of the model. If the model is basically giving you something just automatically without you asking for it, then you should add it to the prompt. The idea would be, instead of the model kind of haphazardly putting together this thing, you actually give it an explicit representation of that in the prompt. So I'll just add field to the prompt here. So if you look at this image relative to the last one, the background here it looks kind of like pasted on. Flat thing that's just kind of there. Whereas in this image, it looks like now she's standing in a field and it slowly gets further and further away, as opposed to it just being one-dimensional flat background. There's actually more stuff to the image than that. But again, the depth doesn't just stop in the sense of the person and the background. There's also the foreground, adding elements to try to mix the foreground and the background together. An example would be if we added, say, restaurant. The point being that if you're in a restaurant, you're going to be more likely to have things surrounding you, have something in the foreground, have something in the background as well. Generally, if you add restaurant, you probably want to add sitting as well, since if you add someone to a restaurant, they'll rarely be there's a bunch of images where people are sitting in restaurants, basically, right? So, and again, this is the aspect of leaning into the bias of the model. If the model is going to give you X, it's better to give it X back so that it will double down on that, as opposed to putting a bad quality version of the particular thing. Oh wait, I still have her in the field. Oh god. Unintended consequence here. I forgot to remove the field thing. I didn't want her to be in the fields. Hey, regardless, I could show you what this does when it finishes here. You could see here what we're getting, what we want, right? We have now not just the background, but the foreground, adding depth to the image. And when I say depth, I mean that in a literal sense of you're adding layers to the image, but more importantly, we're adding more things in the image that are more realistic, that feel more real, that make it feel better. You understand? So, of course, we don't want her to be in a field. We wanted her to be in an actual restaurant. So I forgot to remove field from the prompt here. Okay, so this is now what we have here, right? Where we have the table in the foreground. We have the background, which has like some people in the background, right? We have like a wall. We have like we have extra stuff that is being added to the image that aids in the overall believability of the scene. So it's not just, again, it's not just you want to be thinking of what words make things have better pixel quality or whatever. You want to be thinking of what are the elements of these images that you would want. So depth is a very good way of thinking of it, right? I want something in the foreground. I want something in the background. I want something in the middle. And the things they should have elements themselves, right? Where the person should be described in some way, right? What action they're doing should be described in some way. These are the ways that you need to think about generating realistic images using these models, and not just which special keyword you're going to need. Okay, so the more generic way that you would improve quality would be like a second pass. So what's a second pass? Well, I'm going to show you. Generally, depending on the UI that you're using, this will be named differently. Some will call it a second pass, some will call it high-res fix, but ultimately it's all the same thing. You take the initial image and then you generate it again, but at a lower denoise level. Basically what this means is that I'm going to be generating the image that I started with, but I'm going to be adding detail to it because I scaled it up and I'm using it as the starting point. We're largely using basic settings when it comes to generating these images here because I want to focus more on the overarching things that will get you more value. So the resulting image that we get here will be higher resolution since we scale the image up and then we generate it again, so we'll have a higher resolution image. But also you should have a higher quality image as well. If you look at the image here relative to this one, you'll notice that there's a lot more detail. There's a lot of detail that is added to the secondary version of the image. Okay, for this next one, we're gonna add in an additional thing. Okay, what we have now is a IP adapter. So IP adapter is like this thing you can use to modify the image generation process by adding images to the pipeline. Effectively, you could use images as prompts in a sense. This is a good way of adding general aesthetics to your image that could be hard to describe. So a good rule of thumb, if you're trying to create a realistic image, would be to find a similar image that is real, that has the aesthetics that you want, and you can use that at a very low strength to generally push your image towards the sort of things that you want. This is the image I'm going to be using here as the restaurant image. In general, this is a image that has good lighting, it has a foreground, a background, these sorts of things. I'll put this like 0.25. So just so you understand, the image is not going to look like this image. Well, I mean, unless I put it at a higher strength anyway, it's not going to look like this image. It's just going to look like it's going to absorb the aesthetics of the image. So I'll show you what that means. And if you do this, you'll end up with an image that has more advanced lighting relative to the image that you've used here. You'll end up with an image where you have better control over the lighting. Because oftentimes you would want to use prompt to control the lighting, say like studio lighting or rim lighting, backlighting, these sorts of things. It is often better if you have a lighting-based prompt to simply use a image that has the lighting that you want rather than attempting to describe the lighting with words. Anyway guys, hopefully this was a helpful video for you guys. I really wanted to make sure that I didn't just tell you do X, do Y, do this, do B, do C. I really wanted to try to make it where you understand better how these things work so you can make those decisions for yourself, because if I just tell you one thing, then you might be able to create some good images following this exact specific thing. But if I teach you this, then you will be able to create a lot of different images that are of high quality, right? So that's why I really wanted to try to explain, even though in some parts I probably just end up droning on about something. I really just wanted to do that. Anyway guys, thanks for watching the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.